Okay, we're going to talk about, and again I'll go through this fairly quickly, it's because we covered it yesterday, but we're going to talk about the aftermath at Ford's Theater. We said yesterday that after Lincoln was shot, he was immediately cared for by a 23-year-old physician by the name of Dr. Charles Leal. He had only been on the job like 45 days as a licensed physician. And he laid the president on the floor and began what they call at that time artificial resuscitation. And I mentioned he actually gave mouth-to-mouth to Lincoln, which was a little unusual in those days. It was kind of a newer technique, and so I think some people in the box might have wondered a little bit what he was doing. He then rubbed his fingers through Lincoln's hair and he found the gap in his skull where the bullet had entered, and he noted that the president's pupils were dilated, and he made the comment in the presidential box, "His wound is mortal, it is impossible for him to recover." So the decision was pretty much made then that Lincoln would not survive this, that he would simply die a slow death. Well, there was a call for water for President Lincoln, and it was lead actress Laura Keene who brought a pitcher of water and a glass to the presidential booth. After that, she was asked to hold the president's head as they administered that water and worked on him, and she ended up getting the president's blood on both her dress and the cuffs of her dress, which we mentioned yesterday in class, that the cuffs of that dress are in the museum at Ford's Theater. You can see them with the president's blood on them. It's pretty remarkable that that kind of history was saved. At this point, as I mentioned, it was very apparent that Lincoln would not survive, and he certainly wasn't going to survive a trip all the way back to the White House. So the decision was made that they would take him directly across the street to the second floor of the Peterson boarding house, where he would finish out the remainder of his life. And Union soldiers who just happened to be in attendance at the theater production actually lifted President Lincoln above their heads and carried him across the street to that particular home. Then we talked about two other assassination attempts. I think we only got to the first one, was that right?
Yeah.
Okay. In the meantime, yes?
Did they just lift like Lincoln's whole body, or did they put him on like a board?
No, let's just lift his whole body over the top of the head. In the meantime, these other two assassination attempts were to be occurring, and Lewis Powell was assigned to kill the Secretary of State William Seward, and David Harold was going to help him. When the two men arrived at the Seward residence, Harold simply held the two men's horses while Lewis Powell went in to do the dirty work, so to speak. Powell simply knocked on the door. He had a brown paper bag with him. When the servant, Seward's servant, Negro servant, answered the door, Powell said he was there to give personally medicine to Secretary of State Seward. He was to deliver that himself. The servant didn't really buy that because he didn't know the guy very well. He argued with him a little bit that he would take it up, and finally Powell simply just walked past him, ignored him, and went into the upstairs, the bedroom area of the residence. When he got to the top of the stairs, the one he confronted was Seward's son Frederick, who was serving in his seat as Secretary of State. He calmly told Frederick Seward the same thing. He was there to deliver personally this medicine to Secretary of State Seward. Again, Frederick did not know him, and as a result of that, he said, "No, I'll take the medicine to my father." And at that point, Powell was losing, I guess, patience and time, and he pulled out his revolver, pointed it at Frederick Seward, pulled the trigger, and it misfired. As a result of that, he simply took the butt of the pistol and hit Seward over the top of the head with it so hard that it fractured his skull. Okay? He then took a turn towards the bedroom, and at that time, Fannie Seward, who was Secretary of State Seward's daughter, saw the happenings in the hallway and began to scream. And then the bodyguard that was assigned to William Seward, George Robinson, came out to try to restrain Powell, and he was soon overtaken by Powell, and Powell then made his way into the bedroom of William Seward. He took out his hunting knife and he stabbed at Seward's body several times, missing each time because he was so frail. Then Powell concentrated on the upper torso and stabbed at Seward, stabbed him in the neck and the cheek, and then slashing his face with the knife. By the time he got done with that, he turned to leave, and George Robinson had regained composure and tried to stop Powell, but he got away and escaped on his horse. Witnesses at the scene stated that the bedroom looked like it had been bathed in blood, and Secretary of State Seward, although would live, would be disfigured for the rest of his life because of the assault that he was given by Powell. Now, is that where we ended? Okay. Meanwhile, George Atzerodt is the man that's going to be assigned to kill Vice President Johnson. George Atzerodt. And what he does is, the Vice President Andrew Johnson's residence is actually at a place called the Kirkwood House. And it was a boarding house per se. And Atzerodt had earlier went and rented a room right above Andrew Johnson's residence in the Kirkwood House, with the thought process is that's where he would plan his assassination strategy. So Atzerodt rents a room right above Vice President Johnson's residence in the Kirkwood House, and then he simply goes to the bar to get a little bit of courage, so to speak. He goes to the bar and has a few drinks, to try to gain some courage for the event that he's about to put himself through. Well, Atzerodt was an interesting guy, because if you look at pictures of him, man, he looks like a fierce, hardcore dude. But the fact of the matter was, he really wasn't. And as longer he sat there and tried to get some courage through whiskey, he just continued to drink and eventually just got drunk and did not even make an attempt on Andrew Johnson's life. Didn't even make an attempt. Andrew Johnson had no idea that there was any, at that point, that there was any plan to kill him, and never had any indication of so, because Atzerodt simply did not find the courage in his alcohol, lost his nerve, and got drunk instead. Well, back at the Peterson house, Lincoln is slowly dying, and at his side are his wife Mary and their oldest son Robert. The youngest son, Tad, was taken to the White House because his parent, Mrs. Lincoln, believed he was too young to witness the slow death of his father, and so he was taken to the White House. He was not present at this time. So at the president's bedside will be wife Mary and oldest son Robert. The youngest son, Tad, was taken back to the White House because his mother didn't believe he was old enough to go through such an ordeal to watch his father die. Also visiting President Lincoln during the course of the night, ironically, were Vice President Johnson, who had no idea there was a plan to assassinate him, and several members of Lincoln's cabinet, including the Secretary of the War, Edwin Stanton. Okay? So, many of Lincoln's cabinet members were there, Vice President Johnson was there, and in the cabinet included Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And people came in and out during the course of the night, knowing the ultimate fact that the president was going to die. And finally, at 7:22 a.m., on the morning of April 15th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln dies at the age of 56. So finally, at 7:22 a.m., on April 15th of 1865, President Lincoln dies at the age of 56. Shortly after he was pronounced dead, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton says, quote, "Now he belongs to the ages." So shortly after the president was pronounced dead, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton states, "Now he belongs to the ages." So what's up next? Better find this guy, don't you think? What's the next subtopic? Huh? The manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. What does Booth do? Okay? Well, we know he left the back of the theater, right? Got on the fast horse and took off. But where did he go? Well, he leaves Washington, D.C. by crossing the Potomac River and goes into the state of Maryland. Okay, so he leaves Ford's Theater, he rides out of Washington, D.C., goes across the Potomac River and into Maryland, where, weirdly enough, he meets up with David Harold, the guy that assisted Lewis Powell in the attempted assassination of William Seward. So he meets up in Maryland Booth does with David Harold, who had just got done holding horses, so to speak, for Lewis Powell. They all went their separate directions, and it just so happened that Booth and Harold met up in Maryland. Well, after they met up, they went to that tavern in Virginia that Mary Surratt ran and had a few drinks. And what did Mary Surratt give him there? Remember? Pair of binoculars. Okay? And as Booth left the tavern, he actually told the bartender that he had killed Abraham Lincoln. Told him that. Okay? So after Booth gets into Maryland, he meets up with David Harold. He and Harold go to this tavern in Virginia that's run by Mary Surratt. Have a few drinks. Mary Surratt gives Booth a pair of binoculars before he departs, and Booth actually tells the bartender that he killed Abraham Lincoln. Well, back in Washington, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton orders this manhunt of John Wilkes Booth. He's the guy that orders the manhunt. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. And this was kind of unusual. He even offered a reward for the capture of Booth. $100,000, which was a lot of money, about $1.5 million today. So they offered a huge reward for the capture of Booth. They offered $50,000 and $25,000 rewards for the capture of the other conspirators that they knew about. Okay? And this all came out on a great big poster. By the way, there's only 4 in the world. 4 of these left in the world. And I'm going to show you what one's worth on Pawn Stars here in just a minute. Okay? Well, the reward was $100,000 for the capture of John Wilkes Booth. Because they wanted it. They wanted to find out why he did this, right? You know why he did it, but do they know? And as far as Secretary of War Stanton goes, this is some Confederate conspiracy put together by Confederate President Jefferson Davis to try to re-save the South and get this thing going again. So it's very important to Edwin Stanton that they get Booth and get Booth alive, because they want to find out what he's up to. You know what he's up to, because I told you, but he didn't have any idea. Why would he kill the president? Okay? So, Stanton offers this $100,000 reward. Well, who's going to be searching for Booth? Law enforcement and military, but all of a sudden, if you throw out a $100,000 reward, everybody's going to get involved, because that's a lot of money. So they're not going to have too much trouble getting people to get after him. You know what I mean? But they still got to find him. So back in Washington, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton orders a manhunt of Booth. He offers a $100,000 reward, which is about $1.5 million today. And Stanton wanted Booth alive. He wanted to find out what this guy, what was he doing? Was it a Confederate conspiracy? Was Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, trying to resurrect the Union or the South to fight the Union again? He had no idea. So within just a few hours, they had all kinds of soldiers and all kinds of law enforcement officers and all kinds of normal citizens willing to help in the search for John Wilkes Booth. Well, that night of April 14th, after leaving the tavern, Booth and Harold arrive at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. This is the poor guy that's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And what does Mudd do when Booth shows up? Treats him. Now, he's a doctor. You know when you're a doctor and they bring in a mass murderer that's been shot by police, do you get to say, I'm not working on that guy? No, that's your moral obligation. And so I'm not sure Mudd's philosophy on this. I'm sure he didn't know that he had just shot Lincoln, you know, that type of thing. But he treats him. He's a Southern sympathizer. He is for the South. And he treats Booth by placing a splint on his leg, fixing him up the best he can, and then the two men leave the Mudd residence, and for the next 6 days they basically camp out in the swamplands of Maryland. That's what they do. So they leave the tavern, They head to Dr. Samuel Mudd's home. Mudd treats Booth's broken leg, splints it, treats it the best he can. The two men leave, and for the next 6 days, they're basically hiding out, camping in a wooded swamp in Maryland. Okay? So far, so good? Well, on April 23rd, nine days after the assassination, Booth and Herold crossed back into Virginia. On April 23rd, 1865, 9 days after the assassination, Booth and Herold leave their hideout, so to speak, in the wooded swamp of Maryland and head back into Virginia. And the next day, on the 24th, they arrive at the tobacco farm of Richard Garrett. So on April 23rd, 9 days after the assassination, they leave the swamplands of Maryland, they get back into Virginia, and on the 24th of April, they end up at the tobacco farm of Richard Garrett. And he allows the two men to stay in his barn overnight. Well, early the next morning on the 25th, Booth and Herold find themselves cornered in that barn by the United States 16th New York Cavalry. So the next day on April 25th, early in the morning, Booth and Herold find themselves surrounded in that barn by the United States Army 16th New York Cavalry. And what did they do to try to get the men to come out, Luke Mortimer? What would you do if you were them to try to get them to come out? Now, you don't want to kill them because they want them alive. So what might you do to get them to come out? What's that? I can't. Well, you could threaten them, but they ain't going to go. What would you do to get them out? You can't shoot them out. What? Burn them out. They started the barn on fire, hoping to smoke them out. So early the next morning, the cavalry unit sets the barn on fire to try to smoke the two men out. And David Herold comes out immediately and surrenders. But Booth is resistant. He's in there armed with a pistol, and he's staying in there. But Herold comes out right away. But Booth is resistant to capture, and he stays inside the barn, and he's armed with a pistol. Now, as I mentioned, all these units that were deployed to help find him were given the word by Edwin Stanton to what? Bring him back alive. So this cavalry is going to take chances if they're fired at or whatever. Their orders are still the same. Okay? Well, here's where it gets a little crazy. Booth is inside the barn, and if you've been around old barns, there's always cracks where you can see inside, right? And there's a sergeant from the cavalry by the name of Boston Corbett. Okay? And he's watching Booth inside that barn. And he sees him moving around, and sometimes he sees him and sometimes he doesn't, and he can tell he's got a pistol in his hand. So he's looking at Booth through the cracks of the barn as the assassin is shifting in and out of view with this gun in his hand. And the flames are rising around the barn, and the barn's on fire. And Corbett's got his pistol out, and he's fixated on Booth as he's moving around in this barn. And all of a sudden, Corbett later states that he saw Booth aim his pistol outside at Union soldiers, and as a result of that, he fired his pistol at Booth through the barn. Okay? So as the flames rose in and around the barn, Corbett trained his pistol on the image of Booth. He then watches and later stated that Booth had pointed his gun outside toward the Union troops, so he defies his orders and he shoots and hits John Wilkes Booth in the neck, severing his vertebrae, leaving him permanently paralyzed for the moment. So he defies orders. When later asked about it, he said that, hey, he was pointing a gun at the Union soldiers, didn't matter really, still shouldn't have shot him. He did shoot him, hit him in the neck, severed his vertebrae, left him paralyzed. And the Union soldiers simply drug him from the barn and laid him on the porch of Garrett's farmhouse. So cavalry soldiers then dragged the mortally wounded Booth from the barn and laid him on the porch of Richard Garrett's home. And shortly afterwards, Booth dies at the age of 26. Not a good move on Boston Corbert's part at all. Now, Izzy Berkey, why in the world would he defy those orders and shoot John Wilkes Booth despite the fact that Edwin Stanton made it very, very clear he wanted him alive? What was his explanation when they asked him? Yeah, that's exactly right. When he was asked, he said, God wanted me to do it. That was his response when asked why he shot. Which meant what? He must have been some sort of a religious fanatic, is what we'll call him. There's a difference between a religious guy and a fanatic. He was a religious fanatic. Now, I don't know how much of this you need to write down because it's a little off color, this story, but I'm going to tell you about Boston Corber because I think you need to know. That's why this is AP history. So just kind of listen to this. He was a religious fanatic. At the age of 26, he swore off liquor. He was a pretty big drinker, and it got him into trouble. And when he got to be 26 years old, he swore off liquor, and he grew his hair and his beard long, trying to look exactly like Jesus Christ. That's what he did. Now, he was originally baptized by a Methodist minister, and he was baptized Thomas Corbett, but he changed his name to Boston because that was the town in which he accepted Christ. He was in Boston, so he changed his name legally to Boston Corbett. You can see